The call that changed everything. 3 years. That's how long Dean Martin had been silent. No interviews, no performances, no public appearances. His son was dead. His voice was gone. The Rat Pack was scattered. But what nobody knew was that Rosa Martinez, Dean's housekeeper, had been keeping a journal. Every day for those 3 years, she documented what the world couldn't see, the man behind the legend slowly disappearing. May 16th, 1990. Mr. Martin hasn't eaten in 2 days. He sits in Dean Paul's old room, holding his flight jacket. I don't think he knows I'm there anymore. On May 18th, 1990, Dean finally stepped out of the shadows, not for himself, not for Frank, for one reason, to say goodbye to his brother, Sammy Davis Jr. And in the final moment of that funeral, Dean Martin did something nobody had ever seen. He fell, not physically, but emotionally, completely, and it broke everyone who witnessed it. But what happened after that moment, what really happened, would remain hidden for decades. The producer's wife who saw everything. It was a Thursday morning in Beverly Hills. The sun was bright, almost offensively cheerful for a day that would become one of the darkest in Hollywood history. Margaret Feldman stood at the edge of Forest Lawn Memorial Park, notepad in hand. She wasn't supposed to be there. Her husband, Jerry Feldman, had produced 3 of Sammy's television specials in the 1970s. He'd gotten them both invitations, but Jerry was in London for a shoot. "Go anyway," he'd told her. "Pay our respects. Take notes. This is history." Margaret had no idea how right he was. The Forest Lawn Memorial Park was already filling with mourners, movie stars, musicians, politicians, all dressed in black, all there to say goodbye to Sammy Davis Jr., the man who danced, sang, and charmed his way into America's heart. But there was one man nobody expected to see, Dean Martin. Margaret checked her watch, 9:47 a.m. She'd been a production assistant for 15 years before marrying Jerry. She knew how to observe, how to capture details others missed. She pulled out her tape recorder, a small Sony Walkman, and began documenting everything. Thursday, May 18th, 1990, 9:47 a.m. The atmosphere is thick. You can feel the grief before you even see the faces. The ghost returns. For 3 years, Dean had been a ghost, ever since March 21st, 1987, when Dean Paul Martin died in a fighter jet crash over the San Bernardino Mountains. Dean had retreated from the world. But what most people didn't know was the last conversation Dean had with his son. Dean Paul had called him the night before the training mission. "Dad, I'm thinking about leaving the Air National Guard, maybe focus on acting full-time. What do you think?" Dean had been drinking. He'd been drinking a lot those days. "Do what makes you happy, kid. Just be careful up there." "Always am, Pops. Love you." "Love you too." Those were the last words they ever spoke. The man who once commanded stages in Vegas, who drank and laughed with Sinatra and Sammy, who made millions fall in love with that amore, had simply vanished. His manager tried to get him back on stage. The offers were endless. Vegas wanted him. Television wanted him. The world wanted him. But Dean said no. Always no. He'd stopped singing, stopped smiling. Some say he'd even stopped living. What they didn't say was that Dean had developed agoraphobia. Dr. Richard Chen, Dean's private physician, would later reveal in a 2015 interview that Dean suffered from severe panic attacks whenever he tried to leave his Bel Air mansion. He'd get to the front door and his body would simply shut down, sweating, hyperventilating, chest pains. He was convinced that if he left, something terrible would happen, and given what he'd already lost, who could blame him?
The phone call from Frank. When Sammy Davis Jr. died on May 16, 1990, after a brutal battle with throat cancer, the entire entertainment industry went into mourning. Frank Sinatra immediately began organizing the funeral. He called everyone: Liza Minnelli, Stevie Wonder, Michael Jackson, Quincy Jones. The biggest names in show business confirmed they'd be there. But when Frank called Dean, there was silence on the other end of the line. "Dino," Frank said, his voice breaking, "Sammy's gone. The funeral is Thursday. I need you there, Pally. We all need you there." Dean didn't respond immediately. Frank could hear him breathing, slow and heavy, like every breath was painful. "I don't know if I can do it, Frank. I don't know if I can watch another brother go into the ground." Frank Sinatra, the chairman of the board, the man who never begged. "Please, Dino, for Sammy. He loved you. He'd want you there." There was a long pause. Then Dean said something that made Frank's blood run cold. "Sammy was my right arm, Frank. When I lost my boy, I lost my heart. When I lost Sammy, I lost my soul. What's left of me to bring?" Frank didn't have an answer, but he knew Dean would come. He had to. What Frank didn't know, what nobody knew until Rosa's journal was published in 2018, was that Dean had already made a decision. This would be his last public appearance. After Sammy's funeral, Dean had planned to disappear completely. He'd even drafted a will that morning, leaving everything to his remaining children. "If I don't make it back from this," he'd told Rosa, "make sure the kids know I love them." Rosa had been terrified he meant something worse. The morning of decision. The morning of the funeral, Dean Martin's housekeeper, Rosa, found him standing in his closet, staring at his suits. He'd lost so much weight that nothing fit him anymore. His hands were shaking as he pulled out a black suit. He'd worn it to his son's funeral 3 years earlier. "Mr. Martin," Rosa said gently, "are you sure you want to go?" Dean didn't look at her. He just nodded slowly, his eyes empty. "I have to. I owe him that much." Rosa helped him get dressed. She noticed how frail he'd become. The man who once carried himself with such confidence, such swagger, now looked like he might collapse at any moment. His face was gaunt. His eyes were hollow. The king of cool had become a shadow. But as Rosa buttoned his jacket, Dean noticed something else. Dean was wearing Sammy's gold Star of David necklace. Sammy had given it to him in 1965 after converting to Judaism, saying, "We're all God's children, Dino. This reminds me of that." Dean had kept it in a drawer for 25 years. Today, he wore it under his shirt, against his heart. The arrival nobody expected. When Dean Martin's car pulled up to Forest Lawn Memorial Park, photographers swarmed. They hadn't seen him in 3 years. The cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, but Dean didn't acknowledge any of it. His bodyguard, Marcus, walked beside him, practically holding him upright. "Mr. Martin," one reporter yelled, "how are you feeling?" Dean stopped for just a second. He looked at the reporter with eyes that had seen too much death, too much loss, too much pain. "How do you think I'm feeling?" he said, his voice barely a whisper. Then he kept walking. Rosa Feldman captured that moment on her tape recorder. 9:58 a.m. Dean Martin just walked past me. He looks hollowed out, like someone carved out his insides and left only the shell. I've never seen anything like it. Inside the chapel, the atmosphere was suffocating. 500 people packed into the space. Everyone who was anyone in Hollywood was there. But when Dean Martin walked in, the entire room seemed to pause. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned. Whispers spread like wildfire. "Is that Dean Martin? I can't believe he came. He looks terrible. God, he's aged 20 years. Dean heard none of it. Or maybe he did and just didn't care. He made his way to the back row, as far from the casket as possible. He didn't want to be seen, didn't want to be noticed. He just wanted to be there, quietly, to honor his friend. But someone else noticed Dean's arrival with particular intensity. Altavis Davis, Sammy's widow, was sitting in the front row. When she saw Dean enter, she turned to her sister and whispered, "He came. I didn't think he'd come." She'd visited Dean twice in the 3 years since Dean Paul's death. Both times he'd refused to see her. She'd left messages. He never called back. She'd assumed he blamed her somehow, blamed Sammy for still being alive when Dean Paul wasn't. But here he was, and that meant something. Frank Sinatra was already at the front, standing near Sammy's casket. When he saw Dean, their eyes met across the room. Frank's face crumpled for just a moment. Then he composed himself and nodded. Dean nodded back. No words were needed. They'd been brothers for over 40 years. They spoke in silence. The service began. Reverend Jesse Jackson delivered the opening remarks. He spoke of Sammy's incredible talent, his resilience, his fight for civil rights, his love for his family. The words were beautiful, but they felt distant to Dean. Everything felt distant now. Stevie Wonder performed Ribbon in the Sky. His voice filled the chapel, achingly beautiful, and people began to cry. Dean sat perfectly still, his hands folded in his lap, his face expressionless. The mask was still on, the cool exterior still intact. Margaret Feldman, watching from 3 rows back, spoke into her tape recorder. 10:34 a.m. Stevie Wonder is performing. Everyone is crying. Everyone except Dean Martin. He's sitting there like a statue, but his hands are trembling. Liza Minnelli spoke next. She broke down multiple times, remembering how Sammy had been like a father to her, how he'd supported her through her darkest times, how he'd always made her laugh even when she wanted to give up. Her tears were raw and real, and the entire chapel wept with her. But Dean Martin didn't move. Then it was Frank Sinatra's turn. Frank walked slowly to the podium. He was 74 years old, but today he looked every bit of it. He gripped the sides of the podium and stared down at his notes. But when he began to speak, he abandoned the notes entirely. Sammy Davis Jr. was the greatest entertainer who ever lived. But more than that, he was my friend, my brother, my family. Frank's voice started to crack. We did a lot together, the 3 of us, me, Sammy, and Dino. We conquered Vegas. We made movies. We drank too much, laughed too hard, and lived like kings. Sammy always said we were untouchable, and for a while we believed him. Frank paused, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on Dean in the back row. But time touches everyone, and loss breaks even the strongest of us. Dean felt Frank's gaze, but he didn't look up. He couldn't. Frank continued, his voice now shaking. Sammy used to tell me, Charlie, he called me. Charlie, when I go, don't you dare cry for me. I lived 10 lifetimes in one. I danced with the best, sang with the best, loved with the best. If I die tomorrow, I'll die happy. Well, Sammy, you son of a gun, you did just that. You lived. God, did you live. Frank broke down right there at the podium. In front of 500 people, Frank Sinatra sobbed. The chairman of the board, the man who'd sung My Way like a battle cry, couldn't hold it together. His shoulders shook. His hands covered his face. Security started to move toward him, but Frank waved them off.
"I'm okay," he said, wiping his eyes. "I'm okay. Sammy would have kicked my ass for crying like this." A ripple of sad laughter moved through the chapel. "But I'm crying because I loved him, and I'm crying because I already miss him, and I'm crying because the Rat Pack, the real Rat Pack, is gone now. It's just me and Dino left, and honestly, I don't know how much longer we can keep pretending we're okay." Everyone's eyes shifted to Dean Martin. Dean felt the weight of 500 stairs, but he still didn't move. He sat frozen, his jaw clenched, his hands gripping the edge of the pew so tightly his knuckles were white. Inside, he was screaming. Inside, he was drowning. But outside, he remained the king of cool.
The memory that haunted him. Frank finished his speech and returned to his seat. The service continued. More performances, more speeches, more tears. But Dean heard none of it. His mind was somewhere else. Back in 1960, when the Rat Pack was at its peak, when they owned Vegas, when life was golden and death was just a concept, not a constant companion. He remembered a night at the Sands Hotel. Sammy had just finished performing Mr. Bojangles, and the crowd had gone wild. Backstage, Sammy grabbed Dean and Frank and said, "You know what, cats? We're immortal. As long as we're together, we'll live forever." Dean had laughed. "Forever's a long time, Smokey." Sammy grinned, that mile-wide grin that could light up a room. "Then let's make it count, baby." And they did. They made it count. Every show, every drink, every laugh, every moment. They lived like there was no tomorrow. But tomorrow came, and it kept coming. And now, one by one, they were leaving. But there was another memory Dean couldn't shake, one that hadn't surfaced in years. The Cuban Missile Crisis. The world was on the brink of nuclear war. The Rat Pack was in the middle of a Vegas residency, and nobody knew if they'd see tomorrow. That night, after the show, the three of them sat in Dean's suite. No cameras, no audience, just brothers. "If the bombs drop tomorrow," Sammy had said, unusually serious, "I want you guys to know, this life, right here, this is what mattered. Not the fame, not the money. You two. This." Dean had raised his glass. "To the end of the world, then, and to us." They'd clinked glasses. Frank had made a joke about dying with good-looking corpses. But Sammy had looked at Dean with an intensity he rarely showed. "Promise me something, Dino. When one of us goes, and one of us will go first, don't let it destroy you. Live. Keep living for all of us." Dean had promised. He'd meant it then. But promises made in youth don't account for the weight of actual loss. The procession. The service ended. People began to stand, preparing to head to the burial site. But Dean didn't move. He stayed seated, staring straight ahead, his mind 1,000 miles away. "Dino?" a voice said gently. It was Frank. He'd walked to the back row and placed a hand on Dean's shoulder. "It's time." Dean looked up at Frank, and for the first time that day, the mask cracked. His eyes were wet. "I can't do this, Frank. I can't watch them put him in the ground." "I know," Frank said, his own voice breaking. "But we have to. For him. He'd do it for us." Dean closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and stood. His legs were unsteady, and Frank had to help him balance. Together, the last two members of the Rat Pack walked toward the exit. Margaret Feldman's tape recorder captured the moment. 11:47 a.m. Frank Sinatra is literally holding Dean up. They're walking out together, and I swear to God, they both look like they're walking to their own executions. Outside, the burial procession was forming. Sammy's casket was being carried by 6 pallbearers, including Quincy Jones and Reverend Jesse Jackson. The casket was covered in white roses, Sammy's favorite.
Dean and Frank stood together as the casket was placed onto the platform that would lower it into the ground. The crowd gathered around, forming a circle of mourners. The sky was still bright, birds were singing, and somewhere in the distance, children were laughing in a park. Life was going on, indifferent to the grief in this place.
The moment everything changed. The Reverend said a final prayer. People tossed flowers onto the casket. Some whispered their goodbyes. And then, slowly, the casket began to descend. Dean Martin stood perfectly still, watching. His face was blank. His body was rigid. He looked like a statue. But then something happened. As the casket lowered out of sight, Dean took a step forward. Then another. People parted to let him through. He walked slowly, deliberately, until he was standing right at the edge of the grave. He stared down into the earth, at the casket that held his brother. And then, for the first time in 3 years, Dean Martin spoke in public. "Sammy," he said, his voice barely audible. You told me we'd always be together, the three of us, you, me, and Frank. You said we'd go out on top, together." His voice cracked. "But you left, Sam. You left me. And I don't know how to do this without you." People around him began to cry. Frank stepped closer, tears streaming down his face. Dean's shoulders began to shake. His hands reached out, trembling, and touched the edge of the grave. "I were your right arm, Sam. When my boy died, I lost my heart. And now you're gone. And I'm just half a man now. I'm nothing." And then Dean Martin collapsed. Not physically, he didn't fall to the ground, but emotionally, he shattered. His knees buckled, and Frank and 2 other men rushed to hold him up. Dean's face contorted in pain, and he began to sob, deep, guttural sobs that seemed to come from the very core of his being, the kind of crying that only comes from unimaginable loss. "I can't do this," Dean cried out. I can't lose anyone else. I can't." Frank held him tightly, tears pouring down his own face. "I know, Dino," Frank whispered. "I know. But you're not alone. I'm here. I'm still here." But Dean wasn't listening. He was lost in his grief, in the overwhelming weight of everything he'd lost. His son, his career, his voice, his friends, his purpose. And now Sammy, his brother, his right arm, the man who'd made him laugh when nothing else could. Margaret Feldman turned off her tape recorder. Some moments were too sacred to document. What nobody saw. For 50 years, Dean Martin had been the king of cool, the man who never broke, the man who could handle anything with a smile and a martini. But on May 18th, 1990, that mask finally fell, and the world saw the truth. Dean Martin was human. He hurt, he grieved, he loved, and he'd been carrying more pain than anyone realized. As Frank and the others helped Dean back to his car, photographers captured the moment. The images would appear in every newspaper the next day. Dean Martin breaks down at Sammy's funeral. But those who were there said the photos didn't capture the real story. They didn't capture the sound of Dean's sobs, the way his body shook, the way Frank held him like a father holding a broken son. What the photos also didn't capture was what happened in the limousine. Dean sat in the back seat, Frank beside him.
Neither spoke for several minutes. Then Dean reached into his jacket and pulled out Sammy's Star of David necklace. "He gave this to me in '65, Dean said quietly. "Told me we're all God's children." Frank nodded, unable to speak. Dean looked at the necklace, then at Frank. I think I'm ready to go home now, Frank. Really home. Wherever Dean Paul is, wherever Sammy is, that's home." Frank grabbed Dean's hand and squeezed it hard. "Not yet, Dino. Not yet. I still need you here." But they both knew the truth. Dean had already left. His body would stay for 5 more years, but his spirit had followed Sammy into that grave.
The life lesson. The story of Dean Martin's breakdown at Sammy Davis Jr.'s funeral lives on because it reminds us of something crucial. Even the strongest people carry pain. Even the most confident people have moments of doubt. Even the coolest people feel the heat of loss. Dean Martin spent his entire life making people smile. He gave joy to millions through his music, his movies, his charm. But in the end, he was just a man, a father who lost his son, a friend who lost his brothers, a performer who lost his voice, a human being who lost his will to keep pretending. And on May 18, 1990, when he finally let the world see his pain, he gave us something more valuable than any song or movie ever could. He gave us permission to be human, to hurt, to grieve, to fall apart. Because even kings cry, and sometimes that's the most courageous thing they can do. Rosa Martinez's final journal entry, dated December 26, 1995, the day after Dean died. Mr. Martin is at peace now. For 8 years, I watched him carry a weight no person should carry alone. He didn't want help. He didn't want pity. He just wanted his son back. He wanted his friends back. He wanted to feel alive again. Now he's with them. And I hope, God, I hope he's finally smiling again. The real smile, not the one he showed the cameras, the one he saved for the people he loved. Rest well, Mr. Martin. You earned it. Epilogue. The letters that changed everything. In 2018, when Rosa Martinez published Dean Martin's unsent letters, they changed how Hollywood understood grief. Mental health organizations began using Dean's story in their campaigns. "It's okay not to be okay" became a rallying cry inspired by Dean's breakdown. The SAG-AFTRA union created the Dean Paul Martin Memorial Fund to provide mental health resources for entertainers dealing with loss. And at Forest Lawn Memorial Park, next to Sammy Davis Jr.'s grave, there's now a small plaque. It reads, "In memory of the Rat Pack, Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, and Sammy Davis Jr. They made us laugh, they made us cry, they made us human." Visitors leave 3 items at the grave: a glass for Dean's martinis, a cigarette for Frank, and a tap shoe for Sammy. The tradition started spontaneously in 1998 after Frank died. Nobody knows who started it, but it continues to this day. 3 friends, 3 brothers, 3 legends, together again, forever.